So welcome to this biology session. We're going to be going over chapter 27 in the biology textbook, and chapter 27 is animal systems. So 27.1 focuses on feeding and digestion. So in this chapter, we're going to be exploring the variety of ways that animals get nutrition. So first, several ways of obtaining food are described. So first we have filter feeders. They get food by letting water pass through part of their body and straining out tiny bits of food, generally algae or plankton, out of the body. So sponges and clams are filter feeders. They just kind of stay in one place and let the water come to them and strain it out. And even big animals like blue whales and humpback whales, they're also filter feeders. They take a gulp of water and then they push it out through their mouths. And their mouths have these long strips of what's called baleen that acts as a filter. So it catches all the food. So they take in water, they push it out, and the food gets caught and stays in their mouth. Detritivores are animals that eat bits of decaying plants and animals and the algae and other things that may grow on them. So detritivores include shrimp and lobster, and sea stars that clean up the ocean floor, and many worms in the soil and in the ocean. Carnivores eat the meat of other animals. So um, there's a lot of different carnivores. We've got everything from weasels to jaguars in the mammal family. There's birds that are carnivores, fish that are carnivores, and then we have herbivores, which are animals that eat plants, like this manatee and this giraffe. And the end of this section in your book, on page 649, that's important to read because it goes over a lot of ways that their teeth and jaws are different for tearing meat and grinding plants. So one obvious thing is that carnivores tend to have pointy teeth for tearing meat, and herbivores tend to have flat teeth for grinding up plants. Parasites are animals that live in or on another organism, and they feed on their blood or tissues. I guess not all parasites are animals. There are parasites that are protists as well, but we're focusing on the animals. So in this case, worms is a good example of parasites. So this is a whipworm, which is a type of worm that's commonly found in dogs. So they get it from outside in the ground. They just get they accidentally eat them, and then they grow in the linings of their intestines. And then the last one is mutualists. So mutualism is a topic that we kind of talked about earlier, where we talked about some animals having a mutualistic relationship, which is a relationship that helps both partners. And often that's kind of for other things in life, and they still use another method to get food. But sometimes the mutualism helps one animal rely on the other for food. So an example is coral that has a mutualistic relationship with algae. So algae are not animals. They're plants or protists, but coral are animals. So the coral actually rely on the algae because the algae use photosynthesis to make food. So the algae feed themselves and they feed the coral. So that was all different ways to just to get food into the body. The next step is once the animal has the food in its body, it needs to break it down to the molecular level so that it can absorb food molecules into different parts of the body. So different animals have different ways to do this. And we can kind of be really general and talk about intracellular and extracellular digestion. So intra is a prefix that means within. Okay, so whenever you see intra, that means within or inside. Intracellular digestion happens inside of the animal's cells. So this is practiced only by kind of really simple animals, things like sponges. The nutrients that they take in just get diffused into specialized cells and they're broken down inside the cell. More common would be extracellular digestion, and this is when the food is broken down outside of cells in some sort of digestive system. And those can be different. So, types of extracellular digestion. Well, all vertebrates and many invertebrates have a digestive tract, which is basically a one-way tube that runs from mouth to anus and breaks up the food in different stages along the way. So it all kind of goes in one way. Your food goes in one end, goes out the other. It's broken down, and the nutrients are sucked out as it goes through the path. So your digestive tract would include your esophagus, your stomach, your intestines, all that. Some invertebrates have a different system where it's just called a gastrovascular cavity is the name of it. And this is a space in the body for where digestion happens, and it's only got a single opening. So the food comes in, it's digested, and then waste is removed through the same opening. Okay, so if you have a digestive tract, you've got two openings. The food goes in one end and out the other. If you have a gastrovascular cavity, there's only one opening. The food goes in, digested, and gets spit back out the same end. And then it discusses breaking down plant tissues. So animal tissues are a lot easier to break down than plant tissues. So carnivores, so animals that only eat other animals, they just eat meat, they generally have a sort of short, simple digestive tract because they don't have to worry about breaking down plants. And the problem is that animals don't make enzymes that break down cellulose. So there's no animals that break down there's no animals that make enzymes that can break down cellulose, which is in plants. So animals that eat plants have to rely on some other system. Okay, so animals that are herbivores that only eat plants and need to get their nutrients from them, they have to have some kind of strategy for getting those nutrients. So there's kind of different things they could do. Some have just really long digestive tracts and they have a lot of bacteria that help digest the cellulose. Others have kind of special pouches that hold a lot of bacteria to digest cellulose. So an example of that one with the special pouches would be cows. They have what's called a rumen. It's a special part of the esophagus, and they'll swallow food, it goes in there, and then they kind of spit it back up and chew it again. It's called chewing their cud. Sounds pretty gross, but it helps them break down the food, which is going to be, grass, which has a lot of cellulose in it, so that they can get the nutrients out of it. Another example of really specialized digestive tract is termites. They have bellies that are full of protists, and then the protists have bacteria inside of them, which break down the wood that they eat. So almost all animals have bacteria in their guts that help them break down food, especially cellulose, but termites have an extra step. So they have protists in them, and then the bacteria live in the protists, and so the bacteria actually do the breaking down. Okay, so that was all about digestion and getting nutrients. The next section, chapter 27.2, is about respiration. So respiration is all about getting oxygen into the body and into the cells and using it and getting carbon dioxide out. So all animals need to do this. All animals need oxygen. Not only does it have to get in the body, it's got to get to every cell, get in the cells, and then carbon dioxide has to get out so we can get it out of the way. This whole thing is called respiration. A tricky thing is that it requires a moist membrane to let these two gases diffuse across it. It doesn't really work if it's dried out. So in aquatic animals, that sounds easy because they're in water, but it does get a little difficult. In aquatic animals, the water and carbon dioxide are dissolved in water, so they can't take in oxygen from the air. So some aquatic animals, really small things like flatworms, and some amphibians even, they take oxygen in right through their skin or other body covering. So flatworms don't really have a skin, but their outer layer is actually just able to take oxygen in that way. But that only works for, really small animals. So larger animals require gills. So gills are structures that help to get the oxygen out of the water. They have large surface area with a lot of capillaries, And when water is pumped across the gills, oxygen from the water diffuses into the gills and into the capillaries. And those are some gills taken out of a fish. Okay, so that's how aquatic animals do it. In land vertebrates, obviously we don't have gills, we have lungs. Um, the lungs' job is to exchange carbon dioxide and oxygen with the air. We mentioned that it needs to be moist, so we're on land. So gills aren't going to work on the reach the outside of the body. So the lungs are inside where our body can kind of help keep them moist. And there's kind of two general patterns. So in amphibians and reptiles and mammals, so that includes humans, air goes into and out of the lungs through the same two-way opening. So you have air come in the oops, that went backwards. Okay, so you have the air come in the trachea and into the lung, and then the lung squeezes and pushes air back out the same way. So that's how we breathe in and out. A problem with that is that it never really fully empties out the lung. So you get some air that's just kind of stuck in the lung in between breaths. So the air comes in, the lung squeezes and pushes most of the air out, but a lot of it just kind of stays there. It doesn't get pushed out. So it's not all that efficient. It works well enough for us, but it kind of could be better. And what makes it better is birds. Birds have a special system where the air flows in one direction. So it comes into one opening and into air sacs. So the air comes in through the bird and goes to the air sacs, and then into the lungs through the back end of the lungs. Let me reset that. So our air sacs, there's several air sacs, but we're focusing down here. So the air comes into those and then in the back end of the lungs and then gets pushed back out the front. So the air kind of just makes a circle inside the bird. And so that way you don't have air kind of getting stuck in the bottom of the lung because new air is always pushing through and circulating it. So this is more efficient because the used air doesn't get trapped in the lungs, it gets pushed out by the fresh air. And there's our lungs again. Now that was for vertebrates. Invertebrates on land kind of have a few options for respiration. Earthworms just diffuse oxygen and carbon dioxide right through their skin. Many insects have tubes for airflow throughout their body, and actually have little holes in their body that allow the air to enter and leave. So in this diagram of a bee, the blue lines here is their air system. So you can see it's just kind of tubes um, that have holes, and the air just kind of goes in and out of their sides and then is able to move through the body. And then spiders have something called book lungs, which are membranes that contain blood vessels and allow diffusion. Kind of like actual lungs, they serve the same function, even though they're completely different structures. So our lungs get the air into our bodies. They get the oxygen into our bodies. But the next step then is getting it to all of the cells. So to get the oxygen to all the cells, we need what's called circulation, the circulatory system. And it serves some other roles too. The big one is to take the oxygen to every cell in the body, but it also moves nutrients throughout the body. So you have, food that you eat, it gets broken down in your intestines, and then the nutrients from it absorb into your blood there, and they've got to get moved around. And then also excreting wastes. So your cells are producing carbon dioxide and they're producing other waste. It's got to get out of your body. So the circulatory system brings good things around all the cells and takes the bad things away from all the cells. Okay, so those are all jobs of the circulatory system. And then there's different types of circulatory systems that we're going to go through. So vertebrates and large invertebrates have a closed circulatory system. So it's called closed because the blood is always contained in blood vessels Okay, so they're tubes that don't really have an opening. The blood goes from the heart to the blood vessels and back. It never leaves the blood vessels. Okay, so that's kind of what we're used to. That sounds like a good thing. You don't want your blood leaking through your body, but we'll talk about what other animals do. Okay, so the blood is always contained in blood vessels. Out among the cells, the blood is in tiny vessels called capillaries, and the capillaries touch a lot of cells and allow molecules to diffuse across the walls between the cells and the capillaries. So that is how the oxygen gets out from the capillaries to your cells. It just diffuses through them. And then how the carbon dioxide gets from your cells back to the blood. What's an advantage of having the blood always in these tubes is it can be kept at a high pressure, so it can be moved around pretty quickly. So that's helpful. And the other type of circulatory system would be an open circulatory system. So closed means your tubes are sealed up. The blood never leaves the tubes. It's always in those blood vessels. But arthropods and most mollusks have an open circulatory system, which means the blood and the fluids start out in blood vessels, and then they kind of empty into these holes called sinuses where it's in direct contact with the body tissues. So it's just kind of washing over the body tissues. And then it drains back into another set of sinuses and kind of gets pushed back to the heart. So an example here is another diagram of a bee, and this is its basic circulatory system. So it has this one big blood vessel going down the whole length of it, and it's got little pumps here that act like little hearts to pump the blood out to different places. And that blood can go through all these holes and drain out into the body and back. So organisms like this, because it's leaving the main circulatory system, the heart can't do all the pumping. So it actually often rely on the movement of their bodies to help kind of squish the fluid around to get it back to the blood vessels. So again, arthropods, so all the insects and other creepy crawlies and crabs and lobsters, they're all going to have a circulatory system like this. And then there's some animals that are really tiny, so they can just use diffusion. So things like flatworms, it's only a few cells thick, so the stuff can just diffuse from one end of the body to the other, no big deal. Now back to closed circulatory systems. So again, vertebrates, some large invertebrates, okay, your circulatory system, it's closed. But there's kind of different levels of complexity in that as well. So we have single loops and double loops. So we'll start with a single loop, because this is the simpler one. So fish and other animals with gills have a single loop circulatory system. The heart has two chambers, so it's got an atrium for receiving blood and a ventricle for pumping it. So the blood goes into the heart in the atrium, and then the ventricle pumps it out of the heart. And one pump of the heart forces the blood out to the gills, and then it collects back into the blood vessels and comes back to the rest of the body and then back to the heart. So the heart only just does this one pump, and it pushes the blood out to the gills to collect oxygen and all the way through the body out to the capillaries where it can interact with the cells and just kind of drains back into the blood vessels. Well, I'm sorry, it stays in the blood vessels. It drains back into the veins and goes into the heart. I apologize. Okay, so they call it single loop because, again, the heart only pumps once and it does enough to push it throughout the whole body. So that's what fish do. And then animals with lungs have a double circulatory system. So the heart has to do two pumps. It pumps blood to the lungs first. So the first loop, the blood leaves the heart. It goes into the lungs where it collects oxygen, and then it comes back to the heart. So that's the first loop. And then the second loop is it goes from the heart and goes out to the rest of the body. Goes through the capillaries where it can touch all the cells and give them all oxygen, and then it comes back to the heart. So that's the second loop. Okay, so you can see the difference. So humans and other animals with lungs have the double loop circulatory system where it goes from the heart to the lungs, back to the heart, and then from the heart to the rest of the body, back to the heart. As opposed to fish, where just one pump sends it to the gills and it goes right from the gills back to the body. And then the last section in this chapter is excretion. So excretion is the term for getting rid of wastes. So we need to think about what our cells do. They're always building and tearing things down, so that creates some waste. And remember, they're taking in oxygen, but they're also releasing carbon dioxide when they do respiration. And that's a big deal. That's waste. So the circulatory system helps get rid of the carbon dioxide, but what about the other stuff? So what we're focusing on here is getting rid of ammonia. So cells create ammonia, which is toxic as they are breaking down proteins. And so the body needs to eliminate it along with other wastes. And so this is kind of a big deal. Okay, your body can't survive with lots of straight up ammonia in it, so it's got to get rid of it. So in tiny aquatic animals, like little worms that live in the ocean floor, it just diffuses right out of the body. No big deal, just a few cells, it diffuses whatever. But more complex animals, they have to have a system to remove it. So we have systems just for getting rid of this ammonia. So the first step is to convert it into something less toxic. Okay, so again, ammonia is super toxic. So your body's first step is let's take care of that. Before we get rid of it, let's convert it into something else that's not going to kill us immediately. So in insects, reptiles, and birds, it is turned into uric acid. Okay, and in mammals, it's turned into urea. So both of those are nitrogen-containing compounds. They're both things that ammonia is turned into to make it a bit less of a problem. So the body still has to get rid of it, but again, they're less toxic. It's not continuing to poison the body before it's dealt with. Now, to fully explain excretion, we need to first remember the details of diffusion and osmosis. So let's look at that. So diffusion is molecules spreading out. They're moving from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. So here's an example where inside of this membrane is a low concentration, outside is a high concentration. So the natural thing to happen is some of it moves across. Now they're a little more even. So when we're talking about stuff moving, so salts, other molecules moving, we're talking about diffusion. Oh, and here it is going the other way. We've got a high concentration inside. Some of them move outside to help lower that concentration. Now, a lot of membranes don't let the stuff move through them. So your cells are semi-permeable. Only some things can permeate them. So some things could go in and out, others can't. If the stuff can't move, so if you've got molecules that can't move in and out, what can usually move is water. So moving water to deal with this is called osmosis. So in this example that you're seeing on the screen, there's a high concentration inside and a low concentration outside. And if these little triangle molecules can't move across the membrane, then what happens is water will go in there to change the concentration. So water will go in, and that makes the cell expand. And so now the concentration is less inside because it's filled up with water. So there's a lot more space for those molecules. So they spread out. So there we go. Now our concentrations look a little more even. So it's important to remember what just happened. Let me show you again. We had a high concentration inside. So the water came in, allowing the cell to expand. So it took up more space and they all spread out. Okay, you could have the opposite though. Okay, sorry. So this situation, there's no change because you have the same concentration both ways. This is what we just talked about. Oh, no, it's not. I'm sorry. This is the opposite of what we just talked about. So this is the opposite of what we just talked about. You've got a high concentration outside, um, and a low concentration inside. So the water is going to leave the cell, making the cell smaller, increasing the concentration inside. So the cell is just going to shrivel up as it loses water. And then if you have um, a low concentration outside, the water will move in to try to stretch the cell out and give it more space. So you learned these terms earlier in a different lesson. Um, they don't come up into play too much in this lesson, but you need to know the ideas. Okay, so you need to know that the water will move depending on what the concentration is. So if there's a high concentration inside, the water will move inside. If there's a high concentration outside, the water will move outside. So that's osmosis. And then remember, diffusion was the moving of the stuff instead of the water. So why does all that matter? Well, for the body to function properly, it must maintain certain concentrations of ions in the blood and the body system. And it can do this by adjusting the water levels. So this is where that osmosis comes in. Okay, if it needs a lower concentration, water will come in, diluting it, okay, giving it a lower concentration. If it needs a higher concentration, the water goes out. Um, so the body often adjusts these water levels while eliminating urea or uric acid. That's when it is easiest to do that. So your blood carries wastes and water from the body tissues to the kidneys. So these are kidneys. And the kidneys' job is to separate waste and extra water from the blood. And when the kidneys um, have different areas in them that do this a little differently. So within the kidneys are areas of high ion concentrations, and that drives osmosis of water. And we'll focus on that a bit more in lesson 5 when we talk about the different body systems, but that's the general idea. Um, for animals that live in the water, we've got issues because we just talked about how the water can move across membranes to change the concentrations of stuff. So for animals that live in freshwater, the body's cells have much more salt and other compounds dissolved than the water does. So osmosis can be a real problem. The water would flow into the cells, making them explode. Okay, so this is the diagram from your book. Um, inside the fish, there's more salt, higher concentration of salt than outside. So the water is going to move inward. So if the water is moving into the cells, it's going to puff out all those cells. So fish do a couple of things to combat this. So first of all, they actively pump in salt across their gills, which makes the water in their body salty. So their body is already salty. They take water in when they eat and whatever, and they pump in salt so that the water that's stuck in their body is also salty. So that way there's not as much osmosis happening. The other thing they do is remove a lot of excess water from their body. So fish and amphibians, they pee a lot. And they do that just to get excess water out of the body so it doesn't screw up their balances. For animals that live in salt water, they have the opposite problem. The water around them has a high concentration of salt and it's higher than the cells in their body. So if they have salt water, they eat and bring salt water into their body, um, it's got a higher concentration than their cells, so their cells start to lose water. The water leaves their cells and goes and tries to neutralize the water that they've drank. So if they didn't do anything about it, osmosis would make their cells lose water and they'd shrivel up. And so they fight this problem with two things. These fish pump the salt water out across their gills, which makes the water in their bodies less salty. So again, it doesn't drive osmosis as much because it's less salty than the water that's outside. and they also conserve water. So their urine is very concentrated so that they're not releasing a lot of water. So you can see they do the exact opposite thing as freshwater fish. Let me go back. So freshwater fish pump salt into their body as much as they can, and they pee a lot. And saltwater fish, they pump salt out of their body and they try not to pee a lot, and their urine is very concentrated, so they're not getting rid of a lot of water. So they want to keep a lot of water in their body. Okay, so those are animals that live in the water. For animals that live on land, we don't have the problem of being surrounded by water that's going to drive osmosis, but we have to be careful not to dry out. So for animals that live on land, the excretory systems help them conserve water. So insects and worms and snails, they have processes that let them excrete concentrated wastes without losing much water. And for mammals and, well, other vertebrates that have kidneys, they kind of don't so much. So mammals definitely don't. That's why they need to drink so much, because they have pretty watery urine. Um, but the kidney's job is to get rid of the urea or uric acid, and there's just different concentrations. So again, mammals, it's pretty watery. Other land animals have kind of different concentrations of stuff that they're getting rid of. So again, for more details on it, you can look in your book. When we get to lesson 5 and talk about the excretory system in detail, you'll learn more about how the kidneys work. But for now, that's the end of this chapter. And if you have any set questions, don't hesitate to contact an instructor.